webinar in a series since it started in April. And our co-hosts are Tibetan Youth Congress, which you know is a very famous organization of Tibetan diaspora. It's the largest social political organization of Tibetans living in exile. It has more than 30,000 members. And to say it in short, Tibetan Youth Congress is the nursery of the Tibetan leadership in the field of politics, in the field of social work and social thinking. Tibetan Youth Congress has functioned as a nursery of creating leaders. So, welcome everybody. We have today two main speakers. One is Professor Dr. Martin Mills, who is a very well known authority in the field of environment when it concerns Tibet and Himalayas. He is the director of the Scottish Centre for Himalayan Research at the University of Aberdeen, and he has been previously very closely associated as briefing officer and secretary to the Scottish Parliament's cross-party group on Tibet, and he played a very pivotal role in as a coordinator of the Scottish Parliamentary Third Pole Climate Change Inquiry, which went on for about more than 2 years. It concluded this year from 2019 to 2021. And this report, the title is Climate Changes on the Third Pole, Causes, Processes, and Consequences. It's a document, like a ready reference document. I have seen it on the net, and all those who are interested in understanding this subject in details, you are welcome to go to their website of the Scottish Centre for Himalayan Research, and of course the Scottish Parliamentary uh, group on Tibet. So you can see it on the web for details. We have our other speaker, uh, Ms. Deshan Palmo, who is a research fellow at the Environment and Development Desk of the Tibet Policy Institute in Dharamsala, which is a very leading think tank and conducts research and studies on various aspects of Tibet. Especially her desk is associated with environment, and her specialization is on Tibet's transboundary rivers, and her personal focus is on Brahmaputra and Mekong. And she has submitted her PhD thesis on the same subject. And we wish her success. And I hope when next time when we meet, then we'll be addressing her as Dr. Deshan Palmo. So, Dr. Mills, welcome to this group, and Deshan Palmola, welcome to this group. We have other members here, Professor Ayushi Ketkar, who will be joining us very soon. She will handle questions and answers. So, all our audience friends who have their questions, please feel free on the chat box. And Dr. Ayushi Ketkar will be handling those questions and coordinate with our panelists about uh, those questions and answers. And then we have Anjali Mishra, who is with us, who is our media expert. Welcome to all. And we have I'm sorry, I mentioned, forgot to mention one very important member, Mr. Sonam Tsering, who is the General Secretary of Tibetan Youth Congress, who is the co-host of this meeting. Sonam Tsering ji, welcome to this webinar. And we will be now starting with our main proceedings. Our both speakers, Dr. Mills and Deshan Parmola, will have 20 to 30 minutes to make their presentation. Please feel comfortable. We are not, in that sense, very tight about the timing of your talks. our basic purpose is to understand this subject, which is so important because Tibet has come into the center of international attention because of its importance on climate matters. As everybody knows, that Tibet is occupies nearly 2.5 million square kilometers, which is which, which is an occupied country by China, and it is because of Tibet that today Tibet and East Turkestan and South Mongolia, which were occupied in since 1946, that China has become so big, what we call People's Republic of China. So today Tibet occupies about one fourth of the geographic area of China. And just to say it in very short, we will be focusing on the climatic changes in Tibet. Of course, these changes we know are happening because of so many factors, because all over the world things are changing and the climate is getting affected in severe way. But today we'll be focusing mainly on all those activities which China is has been conducting since occupation of Tibet and in Tibet. So, which these activities in very short are like uh, taming of rivers and exploitation of rivers, um, exploitation of minerals of Tibet and deforestation, the changes in land use, occupation of forcible removal of or dislocation of nomads of Tibetans, land grab by China and Chinese industry and Chinese Communist Party, the demographic changes which are happening there, the military and civil construction like roads, railways, airports, towns, nuclear installations. So these are those issues which are result of, I would say, colonial occupation of Tibet. So today, when we discuss this issue, we'll be focusing mainly on those factors for which China is responsible, and it's, I would say, if we can use the term, the colonial greed which has pushed Tibet to this situation. So, what are the impacts? How these things are, these factors are impacting other countries? Our experts will explain to you. I have only presented a structure of the subject. So now, may I request our friend Dr. Martin Mills, who, as I said, who has played a very pivotal role in preparing the report of the Scottish Parliament, the Parliamentary Third Pole Climate Change Inquiry. So he played a prominent role in it. So I'm sure he understands this subject very deeply. So I request Dr. Martin Mills to please make your presentation. Dr.
Okay.
Mills.
Vijay, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. Um, yes, as Vijay says, I acted as secretary of the cross-party group on Tibet in the Scottish Parliament from about 2016 until the most recent set of elections. During that time, for about 2 years of that, we carried out um, a parliamentary inquiry into the causes, processes, and consequences of climate change on the Tibetan Plateau. This took us about 2 years. Um, it involved reviewing about 900 scientific publications on this area from a wide variety uh, of, of scientific institutes across the world. We actually looked at material from NASA, from the Chinese Academy of Sciences, from the Tibet Environment Desk, from the London Met Office. We took information, as long as we could ascertain that that information was scientifically reliable, we reviewed it as crucially as we could in order to seek out a reasonable scientific consensus on the international stage as to what is happening on the Tibetan Plateau. Now, I'm just going to quickly share my slides. I'm going to give a kind of general introduction. I do want to talk about not simply what China is doing on the Tibetan Plateau, but also the wider climatic changes that are occurring, much of which are international. But I'm just going to quickly share my slides here. Okay, Tenzing, could you show those? All right, this is the report that we produced. It's called Climate Change on the Third Pole, Causes, Processes, and Consequences. You can find it out there on the web. It shouldn't be too hard to find. It's open access, so it's available to all. It's about 40 pages long. We sought in particular to make something that was reasonably readable by policymakers. There's almost no mathematics in particular, and we sought to make it take the scientific data, which is often extremely hard to understand, and render it as readable but as straightforward as we could. The Tibetan Plateau, as you all know, as PJ mentioned earlier, is about 2.5 million square kilometers. So that's about 1 million square miles. That makes it, roughly speaking, the size of Europe. It was generated by the impact of the Indian subcontinent into Eurasia about 52 million years ago, which raised up the seabed to a height of, roughly speaking, around 4,000 meters. And one of the facts of that is, one of the consequences of that is that the Tibetan Plateau, like, for example, the Andes in South America, is extremely sensitive to climate change, in the sense that the climate change increases the further you go above sea level. And by the time you reach about 4,000 meters, climate change is at those kinds of altitudes in mountain regions is occurring between 2 and 4 times the speed that it would sea level. So climate change on the Tibetan Plateau is far in advance, but is following the general pattern of global climate change. This is important because the Tibetan Plateau in particular is traditionally a source of what is called the cryosphere. The cryosphere is the domain of ice. If I were to translate that into Tibetan, since we have the Tibetan Youth Congress with us, that is the term Kawachen, or in Sanskrit, Himalaya. Literally a domain of ice comprised of glaciers, permafrost, and snow. For those of you unfamiliar with permafrost in particular, because it's sort of the invisible cousin of a glacier, permafrost exists as the frozen ground underneath the soil that is frozen from year after year in particularly cold climates. Actually, permafrost constitutes about 25% of the world's landmass. And what it looks like, effectively speaking, is there's a bit of the soil at the top which is not frozen, that during the summer months in particular unfreezes. Underneath that, however, you have what's called an ice wedge. And that ice wedge, effectively speaking, the ground and the water separate out into a solid underground iceberg. And in some of the areas of the world, such as Siberia, for example, those ice wedges can be very, very, very large. They can be as deep as 1.5 kilometers deep. And that is, effectively speaking, about 1 meter to 2 meters underneath your feet across most of the Tibetan Plateau. And the third form of the cryosphere is, of course, snow itself. And that exists on the sides of mountains, across sort of large slabs, particularly of the southern reaches of the Tibetan Plateau, where it accumulates as part of the annual monsoons and the precipitation throughout the year. Now, the crucial bit from our perspective, from the perspective of this report, was the place that cryosphere held within the established place that the Tibetan Plateau holds as the source of all of Asia's major rivers. So whether or not we're talking about the Yellow River, the Yangtze, the Mekong, the Irrawaddy, the Ganges, the Indus, all of these rivers effectively come out of that highland region, at the center of which is the Tibetan Plateau. And the water cycle that is centered on the Tibetan Plateau is undoubtedly one of the most important on Earth. Effectively speaking, we often call the Tibetan Plateau the third pole. That is because it is the largest concentration of freshwater ice outside the Antarctic and the Arctic. However, it is the only one with half the world's population on its doorstep, and that population is fed by that cryosphere. Just to sort of summarize this very quickly, many of you will know from your sort of teenage school years that a water cycle is one in which water evaporates from the seas, such as the Arabian Ocean, the Bay of Bengal, the South China Sea, and it evaporates, leaves behind its salt content, turns to water vapor and heads towards the colder mountain regions. It's drawn towards them by the winds. When it arrives on the Tibetan plateau, for example, during the monsoon and so forth, it drops that water vapor in the form of snow and rain. And it freezes there because the Tibetan plateau is cold. And because it's frozen there, it contributes to that cryosphere, that domain of ice. And throughout the rest of the year, when it is not raining, when the monsoon is not on, when there are no typhoons, when there is no rain, the Tibetan plateau, the cryosphere in the Tibetan plateau gradually melts. And that trickling off of fresh water supply keeps rivers such as the Yellow, the Yangtze, the Indus, and the Ganges, and the Brahmaputra flowing throughout the year. And that's the really vital component, because all of us live within a water cycle. It is impossible to have human existence outside a water cycle. We depend upon fresh water for everything in our lives, from just drinking to washing to agriculture to industry. You can't put salt water on any of these and make it work. Salt water will destroy a machine, it will destroy a factory, it will destroy fields, it will destroy a person if that's all they drink. Okay, so it really is this fresh water supply, for which in Asia in particular, the Tibetan plateau, and in particular its cryosphere, is the year-round supply. So if that cryosphere becomes compromised, as it is becoming, then there isn't just a problem for Tibet and Tibetans, there is a problem for everyone in Asia that feeds off that water. And we know that for example, in very direct terms for the region around the Tibetan plateau, that's 225 million people. If we look at those that are within the valley areas that are fed by the rivers that come off the Tibetan plateau, that's 1.9 billion people. If we think about everything that depends on the products and the foodstuffs, such as rice or anything that comes out of a factory that's near, for example, the Ganges or the Yangtze or the Yellow or the Mekong rivers, anything that is fed out of a factory that uses that water, well, if we look at that food and industrial products, we're really looking at almost half the world's population depend upon that in a very serious and substantive way for their subsistence, for their everyday living. So in this sense, the Tibetan plateau really does provide for about half the world's population. The problem with it is, of course, as you can see from this slide here, is that as time has passed by, particularly over the last 60 or 70 years, the mean temperature of the Tibetan plateau has gradually increased along the line of general global warming. All right, it's increasing faster, but it is increasing in, roughly speaking, the same way. Now, those of you who are familiar with the climate change debates will be familiar with the term of a tipping point. Let me explain to you what a tipping point in this case is. It's 0 degrees centigrade. That is the mark along the line in the middle that blue line is gradually crossing over, because that's the point at which ice turns to water. That is the point at which a cryosphere, the snow, the glaciers, the permafrost on the Tibetan plateau begin critically to melt and not to replace themselves. And as we can see, we have largely across the Tibetan plateau passed that 0 degrees mean temperature, roughly speaking, around the middle 1980s. So across the last century, we really have seen a spike, and that dramatically increased, particularly in the 1990s. From the perspective of the future, our projections, and as far as this is concerned, the IPCC and groups like ISAMOT, for example, have projected into the future that depending upon the amount of CO2 we put in the atmosphere, temperature increases across the Tibetan plateau could be as high as 5 degrees centigrade. Okay, so if we look, for example, at the lower one, which is where it said RCP 8.5 there, and we look for 2066 to 95 winter projections, winter temperatures under heavy carbon, basically business as usual. We simply keep putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We would really be looking at 5 degrees temperature change. That may not sound a lot, but what it effectively means is the end of the Tibetan Plateau as any kind of effective cryosphere, as any kind of regulator of Asia's water supplies. So not only will the place itself warm up, but effectively its capacity to maintain water supplies throughout the year and to provide them in a trickle-down effect throughout the year will be critically compromised. And that means most of those rivers that come off the Tibetan Plateau will become unstable and eventually will become purely seasonal. Okay. And when I say seasonal, I mean that they will carry all of their water in a few months, which means by and large, there will be catastrophic flooding in those areas. Similarly, at the same time, the region will become wetter. And this is ironic because you might think, well, that's probably a good thing. But those water supplies will again get that rain and precipitation will again come during only some of the months per year. And this is estimated that this will occur pretty persistently anyway. This isn't a kind of, if only we do put more CO2 into the atmosphere. It really is about the amount we've already put in, plus whatever else extra we put in. The amount we've already put in will not leave the atmosphere for a long time, for about 50 years. So even if we do nothing at this point, we do know that the Tibetan Plateau will become warmer and wetter over the next 50 years. The impact of this is fairly obvious. Many of you will be familiar with the persistent decline of glaciers across, most particularly the Himalaya, the regions such as Nyenchen Tungla, for example, and places on those lines. There has, until recently, I hasten to add, been what is often referred to as the Karakoram anomaly, which is that the glaciers in the Karakoram range appeared to be actually growing slightly. There was great debate about that, but even that pattern appears now to have ended. That even in the Karakoram ranges around Western Tibet, those glaciers are now beginning to systematically decline, and gradually will eventually become no longer a source of water for Himalayan communities, for the communities, for example, in something like the Indus River, for areas such as Pakistan, Northwest India, all of those regions, many of which are extensive rice-growing regions, will suffer a very substantial decline in the water that is normally glacially fed. And it is expected, even under the present CO2 carbon dioxide drivers, that we will be looking at the loss of the vast majority of Tibet's glaciers by the end of this century. The next one is this effect on permafrost. Permafrost, as I say, is this underlying underground ice and freshwater supply that exists in these large underground icebergs about two meters down. Just to give you a sort of sense of the decline of those of permafrost distribution, this has largely been modeled, I hasten to add, and I need to put in a query here as far as this is concerned. Generally speaking, particularly the Chinese Academy of Sciences have extensively modeled permafrost distribution across the Tibetan Plateau and projected it backwards depending upon the numbers that they have used. I would say their numbers are limited, but so this is the best we've got. In many respects, we don't know enough about the Tibetan Plateau, but the present projections are that if you look here, this is the 1960s, this is permafrost distribution and temperature in the 1960s. And you can see those blue areas are cold and very cold areas. The areas in red were already beginning to likely thaw by the 1960s. And here, as far as this is concerned, it's important to know that warming goes back a lot longer than just 70 years. It's just most pronounced in the last 70 years. Oops. So that is it now, effectively speaking, or at least in the 2000s. Actually, it's considerably worse now. Much of that deep permafrost, particularly around 5 meters down, is increasingly collapsing and disintegrating. We're seeing increasing holes in the permafrost. Its capacity to hold water and to distribute water has been substantially changed and compromised. And simply the amount of cryosphere that is now available on the Tibetan Plateau has taken a very substantial decline. So, what does this mean for the Tibetan Plateau and the surrounding regions? Well, let me just project that in advance. The general consensus is, firstly, increased flood and drought cycles around major rivers flowing out of the plateau. Basically speaking, when the rain arrives, it will not be held in a cryosphere because the Tibetan Plateau is now warmer. As a consequence, it will flow directly back out towards the sea. That will give a flood and a drought cycle whenever there is and is not water coming from precipitation, and particularly monsoons. The second is that the growing instability of permafrost underneath the ground means that land and slope collapse will occur as a consequence of permafrost melt. This will lead to very considerable damage to communities and infrastructure all across the Tibetan Plateau. We're already beginning to see that. The third is perhaps one of the most hard and one of the most counterintuitive is that the increase in warmth and actually even of rain on the Tibetan Plateau will increase the combination of desertification and flood patterns due to the collapse of the underlying permafrost. I'll mention that in a second. And this will also lead to a change in freshwater composition coming off those rivers, with an increase possibly in heavy metals. Looking at those very quickly, we've already seen an increase in river basin disasters across from about 2000 onwards. In many cases, significant flooding and destruction coming from this growing flood drought cycle that's coming off the Tibetan Plateau, with large quantities of riverside communities strongly affected by these. It's more substantial, particularly on the Himalayan side, than it is on the People's Republic of China side. But that is largely because of certain underlying permafrost distributions that make it a little bit different for now, but not for later. Permafrost collapse itself has a dramatic effect on infrastructure. We can see this. Most of these are actually photographs from Canada, photographs from Siberia, where you have land, road, communities, cities even, that are built on top of permafrost. And as it begins to melt, the land quite literally collapses underneath your feet. It buckles railways, it shatters gas pipes and petrol and oil pipelines. It destroys buildings which simply collapse. Roads become impassable. And we do know, for example, that the Chinese Academy of Sciences have projected that, for example, even the much vaunted Golmud to Lhasa railway will become impassable in large slabs of it, will become non-viable really within about 10 to 15 years. And that the number of places where that non-viability is occurring is already occurring. This is not because the railway itself is somehow melting the ground. The railway seems to have been very carefully designed not to do that, but the ground itself underneath the railway is melting anyway because of generalized warming in the area. And as a consequence, that railway will increasingly buckle and become non-viable, with all the implications of that. Similarly, we have seen a growth in the number of slope collapses, particularly around high slope river areas, where effectively speaking, the permafrost that underlies the ground, that holds a mountain together, begins to disintegrate. And effectively, the sides of the mountain simply slump downwards into nearby rivers. And this is causing very substantial problems, again, with the rivers that are flowing off the Tibetan Plateau. Here we have, for example, the blockage in the Yalong Sangpo in early 2018. The dynamic that comes from this is fairly straightforward. The nearby mountain will literally slump down into the river, will block it up. There will then be a buildup of water behind that blockage, which will eventually suddenly breach, as you can see in the sort of right-hand photograph, in photograph B. It will suddenly breach and all of the water will pour down, bringing with it millions of tons of mud and earth as it rushes downstream, in this case into the Brahmaputra and into the Indian plains. So we have a growth in a kind of catastrophic process of disaster construction, and we do know that that is increasing very dramatically over the last 60 or 70 years. If we look, for example, simply for the Yalang Tsangpo, in that particular Sedongpo Basin region, we see one blockage caused by an earthquake in 1950, another caused in 1968, then one in 2014, then one in 2017, two in 2017, three in 2017, four in 2017, and then we have five more in 2018. And those are simply the most recent results that are published. So in each of those cases, a really dramatic uptick in the number of disasters that are coming of this kind. Similarly, and finally, this process of desertification, particularly of river headlands, but all across the Tibetan Plateau, we're seeing a pattern of desertification occurring, where, effectively speaking, grasslands in particular are turning into desert. This is an extremely controversial area because this was an area which was assumed that by the Chinese authorities that this was a consequence of land use patterns. But there is increasing evidence that the land is simply soaking up the waters that are meant to be flowing off into rivers. The rivers themselves are increasingly destabilizing, and the water supply in them is dropping deep into the earth, all across many sections of the Tibetan Plateau, particularly those regions that were about kind of early warming permafrost regions. And what seems to have happened here is that the underlying permafrost, which normally, basically, because ice is waterproof, the permafrost would hold the water that fell from rain and glacial melt and so forth. It would hold it quite close to the surface. If that permafrost melts, that water drops down into the deep underlying ground, and as a consequence, the water table, which is required to grow anything, actually drops dramatically. And so the small roots that grasses have cannot reach water anymore. And so one of the things that we're seeing is a very strange, counterintuitive combination that much of Tibet is desertifying, but at the same time, we know that the amount of water on the Tibetan Plateau is increasing dramatically. This largely came from NASA results, from NASA satellite results, where they measured the gravitational pull of the water inside the Tibetan Plateau. And they discovered that the Tibetan Plateau was gaining water at between 7 and 9 gigatons a year. Where it seems to be doing is kind of deep in the ground, however, rather than close to the surface. And all of that appears to be as a consequence of the permafrost loss. Okay, all of that, therefore it's important, I think, to be clear here, and I refer back to Vijay's comments. I do appreciate that he wants to talk about what China does here, but I think we do need to look at the wider questions of what drives climate change on the Tibetan Plateau. And here I can only speak to what the results were from the review that we did. The primary driver, the most important, the most powerful driver of climate change on the Tibetan Plateau exists at the global level, and that is global greenhouse gas emissions. All right. So, while one can certainly say, for example, that 27% of global greenhouse gas emissions come out of the People's Republic of China, nonetheless, those swirl all around the world, and they come from the US and they come from Europe as much as they come from anywhere else. And that is by far the strongest driver. And even if, for example, China had never invaded Tibet. This would still be so. Okay. The secondary cause is regional, and that is largely air pollution, and that is air pollution coming out of India, Nepal, and China. All right. All of those areas, we have massive urbanization. I'll go to this in a second. We have massive urbanization, and particularly because the winds that cross the Tibetan plateau come from the west and drive towards China, okay, across the Tibetan plateau. Those are the westerly winds. So they tend to draw in air pollution from the west and the south of the Tibetan plateau. So that is the Gangetic Plain in particular, and draw them onto the Tibetan plateau. And that's a product of how the winds kind of work. And therefore, there's a predominance of pollution coming from there rather than, for example, from the coal-fired power plants in places like Outer Mongolia, which certainly also do have an impact. The third is deforestation, local impacts. These are substantial, but they are not as strong as the previous two. Those are local ones. Those are questions about deforestation, urbanization, mining, uh, transport growth all across the Tibetan plateau. These are local warmers that, effectively speaking, warm the ground and warm the atmosphere, just as almost any city and urbanization do, as they do across the world. And these three drivers are the major sources of climate change on the Tibetan plateau. Now, just going through them very quickly, for example, the carbon dioxide emissions. We know for a fact that carbon dioxide, atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases around the world is driven by human behavior. And you can see that here simply on this diagram, where you've got atmospheric concentration of CO2 in the blue, and in the black line, those are human CO2 emissions. As those go up, so does the atmospheric concentration, and so does the temperature. Similarly, here we can see in which the distribution of, for example, air pollution across Asia has shifted in particular over the last 15 or 20 years. This is it in 2005. And this is basically speaking almost all kinds of pollution that affect visibility. This is it in 2005. You can see those catastrophic air apocalypses around Beijing and Chongqing. This is it in 2011. And this is it in 2015. So you can see a growing general tendency in all across the board, but particularly in India and Nepal and Bangladesh, to create air pollution that is feeding onto the Tibetan plateau. Finally, those local patterns, a lot of this comes down to simply about, indeed, land use. If we take someone like this, which is Lhasa City, Lhasa City is presently 168 square kilometers in total land use. If we went back even to the 1960s, it's about 5 or 6 square kilometers. So Lhasa, prior to the invasion, was, roughly speaking, even if you included the normal acre, was 5 or 6 square kilometers. It's now 168. And that is warming all of the land around that. Similarly, we have major industrial factions, particularly that come from things like mining. Just to give you a sort of sense of this, this is the Muli coal mine in Amdo, or Qinghai province. So you can see where it's marked on the star in the top left on the picture. And this thing is 45 square miles of coal mining. And this is producing enormous quantities of industrial level heat, plus opening up land that was previously protected by permafrost. And we know, for example, that particularly since about 2004, there's been a huge uptick in mining across the Tibetan Plateau. But if we add that to the transport infrastructure, to railways, to cities, to economic zones that build around railways, all of these have a local warming effect on the plateau. And therefore, combined with those other two, those regional effects and those global effects of warming, are really critically undermining Tibet's cryosphere, and therefore its capacity to provide basic fresh water to almost all of Asia's population. And I'll finish there.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Mills. And, it was a very enlightening uh, view of uh, the natural reasons for the current situation, climatic situation in Tibet, and also what is happening over past many decades since China occupied Tibet, and how China has been, because of different activities of China, how things have impacted the climate of Tibet. Now we have our expert, Dechen Palmola, who is a very prominent environment expert on Tibet. As I said earlier, she is research fellow with the Environment and Development Desk of the Tibet Policy Institute in Dharamsala, which is a leading think tank. And Desan Palmora has written quite extensively on various aspects of environmental changes in Tibet. She has been studying it very closely. As I said earlier, that her specialization is mainly on the river systems in Tibet. And so I will, and Deshan Parmula was among those experts, Tibetan experts, who were present at COP26 recently to present the case of Tibet and discuss various environmental issues related to Tibet with the word audience. So, Deshan Palmoji, the floor is yours.
Hello, am I audible now? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. Okay. So first of all, I want to thank the Center for Himalayan Asian Studies and Engagement and the Tibetan Youth Congress for inviting me today, and especially to Vijay for your gracious introduction and warm wishes. And today, like as Vijay have mentioned earlier, that recently, along with other four Tibetan delegates, I got the opportunity to attend the COP26 conference. So the main reason for attending this climate conference is to urge the world leaders to put Tibetan Plateau on a global climate change agenda for COP26 and to protect Tibetan Plateau from a further degradation. So I'll share my PowerPoint presentation. Okay, so today's topic is why Tibet should be Center for Global Climate Change discussion. And next slide. And this is the outline of my presentation. First, I'll give a brief background information about COP26. I'm sure everyone must know about this, but just in case, like if anyone doesn't know, so just for this. And then, like, second, I will talk about why Tibet should be Center for Global Climate Change discussion. And third, climate change on the Tibetan Plateau. And fourth, Chinese dam and its impact. And fifth, finally, what needs to be done to protect Tibet Plateau. Next slide. So talking about COP26, the COP stands for Conference of Parties. So in diplomatic terms, the parties refers to 197 nations that have agreed the UNFCCC Convention. And this meeting was first held in 1992 in Rio, and this summit was informally known as the Earth Summit. The first COP was held in Berlin in 1995, and in like over the past 2 decades, they have so many of a discussion. But only in 2015, the nations group of those who have agreed this convention, they have come together and take the responsibility for tackling the climate change. So leaders of 196 countries, they have signed the Paris Agreement in 2015. This deal was considered as groundbreaking. For the first time, rich and poor countries have agreed to act, albeit at different paces, to tackle climate change. The main goal is to limit the global warming well below the 2 degrees Celsius, preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius, compared to a pre-industrial level. So to achieve this long-term temperature goal, countries aim to reach global peaking of greenhouse gas emission as soon as possible and to achieve a global climate neutral world by mid-century. So this is the 26th time the countries have gathered under this convention, Hence, it is called the COP26. Next slide. So, we have been demanding that Tibet should be kept as the center for global climate change discussion. Now, like the question arises, why Tibet should be center for global climate change discussion, right? So, Tibet is important not only for the Tibetans, it has impact well beyond its region. So Tibet lies at an average elevation of around 4,500 meters above sea level, and it is also world's largest and highest plateau, covering an area of 2.5 million square kilometers. It is surrounded by imposing mountain ranges that harbors the world's two highest summits, Mount Everest and K2. Hence, it is known as the roof of the world. As you can see in this picture, that picture taken in 1921 and 2009, there's a huge difference of glaciers melting, and which due to the climate change, the glaciers on this particular mountain in Mount Everest has caused due to the climate change. So due to high elevation, as I've mentioned before, this vast area, it holds the largest number of glaciers and snows outside the Arctic and Antarctic. And Tibetan Plateau has more than 46,000 glaciers, which makes around 14.5% of the world's total. Therefore, it is known as the world's third pole. And these glaciers, 46,000 glaciers, this gave birth to major Asian rivers, as Dr. Martin has mentioned before. Those Indus River, Satluj River, Brahmaputra, Irrawaddy, Salween, Mekong, Yangtze, Yellow, all these rivers have its source in the Tibetan Plateau. And these rivers provide lifeline to many countries and support a population of around 2 billion people. Therefore, it is called the water tower of Asia. So this clearly shows that how important Tibetan Plateau is. Next slide. Next slide. However, the Tibetan Plateau is facing a grave environmental climate change crisis. Although Tibet and Tibetans in no way have caused this rapid rise of methane emission, this rising temperature, ozone hole above Tibet, and the rising runoff from these rivers, but Tibetan Plateau has seen an increase in temperature of approximately 0.3 degrees Celsius every 10 years. This means that over the past 50 years, temperature has increased by 1.3 degrees Celsius, which is twice the global average. Tibetans are among the first to face the direct consequences of climate change. But due to climate change, the Tibetan Plateau glaciers are melting faster than anywhere else on the earth. The loss of Tibetan glacier means loss of livelihood for people who are dependent on these rivers. In August, prior to COP26, the IPCC released a report for the first time as the first part of ongoing sixth assessment report. As you can see, this is the sixth assessment report which was published in August. So this report clearly laid out the policymakers and stakeholders the most up-to-date physical science basis for the understanding of the climate system and climate change. This report predicts that by 2040, average global temperature will be warmer than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level, causing more frequent and intense heat waves, droughts, extreme weather events. So these six assessment reports, unlike the previous fifth assessment report, it provides more region-wide view of things than did in the previous report. So direct surface observation has been documented in this previously less studied area of the globe, such as Tibetan Plateau. So relating to Tibetan Plateau, this report shows that there's an increase in precipitation and river floods in much of the Asia and general wetting across whole of Tibetan Plateau, and Himalayan is projected with increase of heavy precipitation in 21st century. As we have already seen, there's a number of floods and landslides causing due to the extreme precipitation. And other than this, we have the glacier melting. Tibetan Plateau is the largest concentration of glaciers outside the polar region. The most of the glaciers are facing a huge glacier melting. So the most negative changes in this glaciers melting in Asia between 2000 to 2018 was found in ancient Kangla, while glaciers in Kunlun Mountain in Tibet have slightly gained mass. And now I'll talk about the snowfall. There's a decrease in the observed of the frequency and increase in the mean intensity of snowfall in eastern Tibet since 1960. Increased precipitation and glacier melt, as I've mentioned before, have contributed in the rising sea level. So, and flood hazard in regions such as inner Tibetan Plateau. And permafrost, there's increase in permafrost temperature over the last 10 to 30 years of up to zero point 0.3 per decade. And snow, darkening of snow by deposition of black carbon and light absorbing aerosol species as also increases the rate of snow melt in Tibetan Plateau. So all this has been extracted from this IPCC recent report. So this report clearly shows that the climate change has a huge impact on the Tibetan Plateau. Next slide. Okay, so this two code is from, I've extracted this from the IPCC report, and this report clearly shows that human activities have a huge impact on the climate change in the Tibetan Plateau and the further degradation of the Tibetan Plateau environment. So to quote that, human activities such as reservoir operation and water extraction have a profound effect on low river flow characteristics and drought impact in many Asian regions. Higher future temperatures are expected to alter the seasonal profile of hydrologic droughts given a reduced summertime snowmelt downstream of mountains such as the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau. Second, widespread extraction of water from rivers can reduce flows and decrease the level and area of inland seas and lakes. Between 1985 to 2000 and 2015, 139,000 kilometers square of inland water areas have become land, while creation of dams have converted about 95,000 kilometers square of land to water, particularly in Amazon and Tibetan Plateau. So this is now unequivocal that human influence is causing climate change and making extreme events more frequent and more severe. Next slide. So we have this example of how the Chinese dam has impact in the region. For example, in 2019, the Mekong River is at the lowest in 100 years. Such would have been extremely unlikely to occur without human influence on climate system. The situation was made worse by hydropower dam operator upstream in China, withholding water for their own purpose. This study was done by Eyes on Earth in 2020. The report shows that in 2019, for 6 months, China's dam have blocked an unprecedented amount of water from entering the lower Mekong. The amount of water withheld was so large that, for the first time since modern record had been kept, there was no monsoon-driven rise in the river level in the lower Mekong. The Eyes on Earth, this data shows that the upper reaches of the Mekong, they have received above normal amount of water, nearly all of which was held back. And this clearly shows that the Chinese government are holding all these rivers in their dams. Next slide. Talking about this dam, there are 19 dams has been planted on this Mekong River. This Mekong River has its source in the Tibetan Plateau, but in this river there are cascade of dams being built on this river. So as of now, the Chinese have completed 11 dams on this river, and most recent being the Wunolong Dam. It was built in the Dechen Autonomous Region in Yunnan. It's a Tibetan Autonomous Region. Next slide. If we calculate all this dam megawatt, it can power around a medium size of country. So these dams are holding so much water that these are obstructing the river flow in the downstream countries. And you can see that in this picture that in 2017 and as compared to 2019, In 2017, there's an ample water in this region, and whereas in 2019, due to the Chinese dam, and there's a decrease and there's a drought happening in this region. Next slide. So what needs to be done? The Tibetan Plateau is a hotspot of global climate change, and the people in this region are on the front line of global climate change impact. Therefore, it is required to recognize the strategic and ecological importance of Tibet and the Tibetan Plateau, acknowledging its unique biodiversity, its impact on the regional weather pattern, and its place at the heart of food and water security. Second, improve access and transparency in scientific research on climate change, with particular focus on encouraging the inclusion of Tibetan experts in collaborative work. Third, adopt a right-based approach which empowers and engage frontline communities, respect traditional knowledge, and seek to balance the conflicting goals of conservation, economic, and social interests. With this, I would like to end my presentation. Thank you.
Uh, Thank you very much, Deshan Palmoji. You have given a very good understanding of how, especially the rivers of Tibet, how they are being impacted because of various policies of Chinese government, especially the policies about dams. And we know, as an Indian, we understand how serious issue it is because China is not only using these dams to exploit water or to stop water from going to those riparian countries which are fully entitled to that water. But there is another dimension which I would like to, this is right time to point out, that there have been 2002 and 2005, there have been instances when India suffered very heavily because of China's strange policy of using river waters as, if I can use the term, water bomb. It happened twice in Arunachal Pradesh when uh, once it was the landslide which blocked a river and water got accumulated, and that water was deliberately released towards India, and it created havoc twice in Arunachal Pradesh. And it happened, the same thing was happened in Parichu river just across Himachal Pradesh of India, when because of some landslides the river was blocked, Parichu, and a dam, artificial dam, or a accidental dam was created. And China, unfortunately, at that time did not share any information with India, uh, in spite of all requests by Indian government to share information or allow Indian engineers to go and assess the severity of or the size of the artificial or this accidental dam which was being created, because India wanted to be ready in advance for that, but China did not permit. And at the end, the Chinese army exploded that dam on the Indian side. As a result, there were floods more than 100 kilometers inside India, and there was a devastation which was of very big level. And now Indian scientists and experts are worried that when China is coming up with new dams on Yarlung Tsampo, which becomes Brahmaputra when it enters India, China can use this water as a water bomb in delicate moments, and which can create havoc for India, for Bangladesh. So there has been a discussion. There has been many experts have been advising that countries like India, Nepal, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Cambodia, uh, there are at least 10 countries which are directly impacted because of China's policies on the Tibetan rivers. So if they join hands, maybe they can bring some, if I can use the term, sense to the Chinese mind. But that is only one side of one dimension of these the problems which are um, uh, happening in Tibet because of the colonial occupation of Tibet. And as both our experts pointed out, that the issue is not only Tibet, the issue is not only rivers, the issue is not only China, the issue is entire humanity. As Dr. Martin Mills very clearly pointed out, that we have nearly 4 billion people who are directly impacted because of what happens in Tibet. So, thank you very much, both of you, for pointing out these issues. And now, may I request our friend Professor Ayushi Ketkar, because you must have received a few questions over this period. If you have some questions for our experts, please.
Thank you so much, Vijay sir, and namaste and Tashidalek for all the audience who are participating in this webinar. Uh, Dr. Martin and Dechen Palmola have touched upon some very important issue. And as you rightly said, Tibet is not just an issue of a particular community or even a region. It's a global problem. The climate change is real, and it's for all of us to take cognizance of it and make changes. As Dr. Martin in his talk rightly mentioned, that it's a matter of great concern because we have passed the tipping point long ago. So, any delay in addressing this problem and finding resolutions to it is only going to lead to a calamity which probably humanity will have to pay for. And going by what we faced during the COVID times, the last 2 years, I'm sure nobody would want another catastrophe. And especially, this is a catastrophe which is mostly man made. So issues like deforestation, urbanization, and mining, excessive mining, are all man-made problems, and I'm sure we'll be smart enough to understand the implications of it and resolve. There have been some very interesting questions that have come to us. I would like the two speakers to kindly respond to this, and Vijay sir, even some of them are about Indic perspective as well, and the efficacy of it in solving the problem. So probably you can also chip in into this very interesting discussion. So can I begin with the
Yes,
questions, sir?
yes.
Thank you. One question that has come to us is that why is the world so indifferent on the Tibetan issue when it is serious for entire humanity? So I don't know who would like to take that.
No, but
Do
yeah,
I give
both
you
are.
a set of? Okay,
Yeah,
all right. Yeah, we'll take one question at a time, or would you want a
yeah,
set
yeah.
of two, three
It's better.
questions?
Let's have the first question first.
All right, all
Uh,
right. Thank you.
Can we first request Dr. Mills to come up, and
Well,
then we will have the Tibetan perspective from Deshinla.
I must admit this is something I find very interesting and odd. Um, the world is, in a sense, seems to have a limited intellectual capacity for understanding climate change in its many, many dimensions, and tends to focus on one thing. And this, to my thinking, is a really substantial media limitation, actually. In particular, there's a kind of concentration, particularly in what we might refer to as the North Atlantic corridor, on a sort of fixation with sea level change. In the end of the day, human beings can move away from the coast, but they can't. So they won't survive if the land they move to cannot support human life.
Right.
One of the deep problems, particularly with large-scale continents like Asia and the Americas, for example, is that the inner land mass, the inner water supplies, and the inner capacity to produce food in the heart of those continents is also being compromised significantly. And the Tibetan Plateau is a perfect example of this. But what's odd about it is that it isn't the only example. Exactly the same dynamics that are affecting the Tibetan Plateau, for example, are affecting California, where 65% of their water supply comes from meltwater from the Sierra Nevada mountains. They have exactly the same problem. They've known about it for exactly the same time. And yet this dimension, this catastrophic dimension that affects, most of the bread baskets of the world, the Indus River feeds the Punjab. The Punjab is one of India's major bread basket areas, and that's almost entirely glacial water. These things they are strangely ignored, and Tibet gets ignored with it. I think there is a dimension, and here I would emphasize this very strongly, that Tibet has tended to be viewed as a place almost separated from reality, almost placed sort of above it. It's very sacred, it's very different, it's very exotic, it's very all of these things. Whereas what it really is the jigsaw piece at the heart of the entire Asian population. And in that regard, it is an enormous, it's not a small problem that is, for example, China's problem. Here I would, PJ and I think, disagree slightly on this one, and respectfully. My view on the matter is the Tibetan Plateau is as international a problem as the Antarctic is, and probably more so. It's international in its causations, it's international in its consequences, and it is international in terms of particularly those knowledge issues that BJ himself rose earlier. We have to have international knowledge sharing in these areas because the causes and the consequences are so international. And if I go back, if one doesn't mind, goes back to the Strasbourg proposal, the 5-point peace plan put forward by His Holiness back in 1987 precisely embodied that understanding of interdependence. And we really, really need to look to that. So I'll leave that there.
Yeah, thank you very much. Deshan Palmo, I'm sure you have the Tibetan perspective on this question.
Yes, sure. I want to share one anecdote. Recently, during a COP conference, we tried to go to all the Siberian countries and talk about Tibet's environment and Tibet's rivers. So during one incident, like we visited Bangladesh pavilion, and we tried to meet those representative government delegates, and we spoke with 3 persons who are delegates there and sitting in this pavilion. So we told them that the Jamuna River, which is the lifeline of the Bangladesh, this river has its source in Tibet, and in Tibet we call this as Yalung Tsangpo, and from Tibet it flows into India and then into Bangladesh. So they said, yeah, we know about all these rivers, and later on we told them that there are many dams which are built up in the upper reaches of the river. So they said, yes, we know about that. And then later on we asked what your government are planning to do, how you are going to confront this. In future, due to climate change, this water are going to reduce, right? So with all this dam, China have all the strategic power to control this river flow. So what is your take on this? We asked those diplomats, and they said, no, Tibet is very sensitive region. So we can't do much on this. Even though the people, they accept that the Tibetan plateau and those rivers coming from Tibet is very important for them. But due to the Chinese economic and military power, they are hesitant to raise this issue. So that's it's not that people are not aware of this problem of Tibet's environment problem, but they know since like Martin Will has mentioned earlier that it's the international problem. It's not only a problem of Tibet and Tibetan problem, right? So since whatever happens on Tibet, it will have impact. But the downstream countries, they are not recognizing this. They are hesitant to challenge this or raise this issue with the Chinese government. And those diplomats, they told us, people, Tibetan people, should be the one who should initiate this dialogue between all those Arabian countries. So since they know that we are as a Tibetan, as a refugee in India, it's out of our capability or out of our issue. It's not, we are not able to do it because it should be the government, Indian government, Indian government, Bangladeshi government, and Chinese government. They should come together and talk about this rivers problem, damming issues. Not that all those people who are in exile, even though we want to, it's very difficult for us to bring all those parties together and have this discussion on these rivers. So that's how like what I felt about sensitivity of issues on Tibet environment.
If I may add just one point to this, recently we have discovered that with increasing military and economic and diplomatic power of China and its capacity to influence governments, even to the extent of tilting vote in very sensitive United Nations organizations. In view of that, I'll pick up from where Deshin Palmo just now pointed out how the diplomat from Bangladesh was feeling, that they feel the governments feel helpless. So here, I think the world will have to rethink, revisit its strategy to handle China. No question, it's almost impossible for any individual government, especially small governments like Bangladesh or Myanmar or Cambodia or Thailand or Indonesia. It's impossible for them to take China head on or to help to force it to change its decisions or approach towards rivers. But I think these countries can do one thing. They have to put their heads together. They have come to a table, common table, and discuss this issue, which are common to their own future. And then once these 10 or 11 countries go beyond those limitations of being afraid of China, if they, once decide to put up a common voice. Recently, the American government came out with that new Tibet policy law. And there, one of the points is to have an international diplomatic front uh, to handle China. I think the world should take lead from that point also, and keeping in view interest of these countries, especially riparian countries. All these countries should join hands, or at least those organizations, those think tanks who are not governed or who are not guided by limitations of governments, at least they should come out together and put a collective voice. That might start changing the scene as it is. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Actually, you have answered my next question, which was on these lines, especially Dechanla and Vijay sir. The next question actually was, do you think China's growing stature is responsible for the current state of affairs in Tibet? So you have partially answered that. In case you want to add to it, you can. But I'll just go with the next question, which is, China's aggressive designs, both in controlling territory and resources, seems to have no end. In such a state, what is the way out for Tibet?
Yes,
Yes,
yes.
yes, of course, of
Yes,
course,
Dr.
Dr. Martin.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'll join this with the previous question, and I know this is sort of against the accepted truth at the moment, but I think we overestimate China's power if we look at it from outside a purely political perspective, and we need to be aware of that in that regard. You know, for example, one of the things that became clear from the climate change literature was were the limit that actually the quite limited power and control that, for example, China had on the climate in the Tibetan Plateau. All right. But China could certainly change quite a few things in its policy. It could reverse, for example, the nomad policy, because that would be very good for its nomads and wouldn't make a kind of change to the desertification problem, because that didn't seem to have been the cause. It could reverse urbanization. The mining is obviously a big issue. But even if you took away all of those matters, there would still be really substantial climate change effects on the Tibetan Plateau from regional and global effects. All right. So it's important to understand that the People's Republic of China is not in charge of Tibet's climate in its largest form. Right? That is why, to a certain extent, it's an international issue. It also shows the limits of China's power when it comes to these kinds of matters. And I don't think we should overestimate them too much, particularly because China itself, much of its, and here, the question makes reference, the second question in particular makes reference to the Belt and Road Initiative in particular, and the kind of expansion of China's links of dependency outside its borders. All right. And here I'm going to use the term links of dependency because I think it's important to understand some of the larger geographical and ecological context and environmental context that we're looking at here. China faces very substantial, huge environmental challenges that are, effectively speaking, beginning to eat away at its economy's capacity for dominance. Okay, particularly in northern China, for example, the water problem is catastrophic. Absolute water scarcity, according to the United Nations, that is the amount of water that is required to maintain a working population, stands at 500 tons of water per person per year. All right, Beijing has something on the lines of 150 tons per person per year. All right, these are catastrophic water availability problems all across northern China. If many of the changes that we're looking at, that the Chinese Academy of Sciences have been telling Beijing about for a very long time, if many of these changes occur, and most of them are already in train, then China is looking to a catastrophic compromise of its capacity to feed itself. It's unsurprising, therefore, that it is looking beyond its borders. But to see that as ambition, to see that as aggression, I think possibly misses some of the point. We know, for example, that in 2014, China slipped beneath complete food self-sufficiency. And it's now at 95%, and that is 7 years later. So that's a very considerable decline, even in that period of time. So, as I say, with all reference to all of these things, there once was a time when Japan completely dominated everyone's economy. And now you almost couldn't remember that. All things pass, and the bigger they grow, the faster they pass.
But do you think, sorry to interrupt you here, but do you think China is so blinded by its race with US that despite these odds, it still continues to blindly follow its aggressive designs?
No, I mean, let me be clear about what my point was. If it's running out of food, it's going to try and get food elsewhere. So, for example, the expansion into the South China Sea is largely about fishing rights. It's largely about control of access to the seas for precisely those reasons. Many of its expansions on the Belt and Road are into areas that could provide it with food in the future, if it cannot provide its own. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to get people in debt to you. So, it's worth thinking about the puzzle not purely from a political power perspective. There are multiple dimensions to this.
All right. Interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah, I agree with you. And especially, I have one theory which I many times discuss with my friends, that why it is necessary for the Chinese leadership to be aggressive. If I were in their place, and if I were occupying Tibet or East Turkestan or South Mongolia, they are very small population countries. My policy would have been to perpetuate my colonialism. I would have adopted a policy of kindness, policy of smiles, policy of friendship, and try to win their hearts by being kind to them and then exploiting them the best possible way. But here, to me, it seems the crisis with Chinese leadership is of wisdom, which is multiplied by their greed, and both are feeding on each other. And at the end, don't be surprised if very soon we find that China implodes from within. China creates problems, so much problems for others, that they join hands and then they stop Chinese supplies. They are forced to stop paying back to China, and China, the money they have lent out to others, it becomes so big that it becomes impossible for China to not handle the situation that they refuse to pay.
Mm.
So I think the crisis is of wisdom also. And let us pray that a man like Xi Jinping, he shuts down his arrogance, and in that place he fills it up with some wisdom so that the world can live collectively.
Yes. Any word from you there, Chanla?
I don't have much to add. I just want to give a brief to talk about how China they're using those rivers as a strategic tool. So, in what happened in 2017 during a dot-com crisis, China they have stopped sharing those river data, so it caused a huge impact on the Indian side during monsoon period. So like even though they have signed the MOU between India and China, but during the dot-com crisis they stopped sharing. So this clearly shows that like China how they're using those rivers when it comes to during the crisis. So it should be the Indian and the other downstream countries. They should be aware of all those how China are using those rivers and be prepared to confront in future in case if China start using those rivers as tool to control those downstream countries. That's it.
Yes, I think that's a very important point you've mentioned there. We move on to the next question, which is on the role of non state actors, with special reference to the civil society and the diaspora in helping Tibet manage this climate crisis. Might be
I'm
ladies first this
sorry.
time.
So
Rechanla?
maybe I
Okay.
let me
Okay,
intervene with
sure.
request that let it
Sure.
be the second last question. Yeah,
Yes,
because we
all
are
right.
now running out of time. This question and
Sure.
one more question after this, please.
Sure. Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, so talking about the non-governmental organization, there are many NGOs, not NGOs, Tibetan local who are taking initiative to protect the Tibetan environment. There is one environment organization which was run by the Tibetan in, uh, uh, in the source of the Mekong River. This organization is known as a Dachu Environmental Volunteer Organization. So this is roughly translated from Tibetan to English. So this organization, what they do is, the source of the Mekong River, it flows from their region, so their county. So the people over there, they come and clean the source of the rivers, so that the people in the downstream countries have clean and safe water for them. So people they don't know like where the local people they don't have much idea about where this river flows. Since this river flows into all the six different countries, from Tibet to China, then to Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, and so this organization it was initiated by one lamas. So since like most of the Tibetans are Buddhists, and Buddhism in Tibetan religion, Buddhism and environment, they consider this protection of environment very sacred. So therefore, like people over there, that region, they try the full to protect. They thinking in holistic ways. So like in Tibet, we don't have much problem of water resources. There are plenty of water, but the downstream countries, the head of those that region, Lamas, he got the opportunity to go and visit in Mongolia, where he saw that like people are having a lot of problem of water resources. So when he returns back, and he mm, and try to like initiate those people to come and clean those water region and to protect the source of this region. And there are many tourists coming from China, and they think like there are one incident. What happened is like the Chinese tourists he peed on the source of the rivers and saying that his urine will have drink by all those six countries. So therefore, like people in this region, they had meeting, and they said, they put one people to look after that source. So that's how, like people on the ground, they are initiating to protect those rivers coming from Tibet. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Would Dr. Martin or Vijay sir, would you
Yes,
like to?
well, I'd be very happy to follow on for Declan on that one. I think, I mean, this was something Vijay knows that I spoke about slightly in Switzerland recently. I think when it comes to this problem, there are short, medium, and long-term answers to the question. So I'm going to take a leap forward and talk about medium and long-term answers when it comes particularly to civil society and everything on those lines. When it comes to the climate change matters and COP26 and all of those, one of the things that we're seeing is one of the things we're really witnessing is a catastrophic absence of imagination and intellectual power when it comes to dealing with the depth of these issues, because we're not just looking at carbon capture technologies. I mean, the general answer we've got at the moment are almost always technological. But the truth of the matter is that you can't slow down damage to environment when you're still keeping the engine going. And the engine is a powerful pan-human tendency to consume and destroy resources. And a lot of that has emerged most particularly since about the 17th century. And it's a product of a particular kind of intellectual history that's part of the European Enlightenment. I will say that myself. I'll admit to that one. It's a gift that always keeps on giving. But it remains a powerful exclusive materialism that sees human satisfaction in almost entirely in terms of the consumption and management of material resources. And the consequences of that have been both to drive away societies such as Tibetan culture, for example, that looks at different alternatives as far as that's concerned, and has a much sort of wider vision of what a human being can be than simply a consumer or a manager of material resources. It's driven those away, but it's also driven away nearly everything else. And we've got to the point now where our only solutions to it appear to be material mechanistic solutions. The truth of the matter is, in the long run, we're going to have to look at this large question of what it means to be a human being, and what it means for human societies to flourish in a way that they are not destroying all of this. We can't keep everything we've got. But what we really need under those circumstances is a wider range of ideas, particularly about the human. And this is an area where Tibetan culture in particular has flourished for 1,300 years in developing the concept of what it is to be human. And they should be bringing this to the table. All right. They shouldn't necessarily be sitting there saying the only answers we can have here have got to come out of the United Nations and COP and other Western things. Tibetans have a lot of the discussion points that really need to be on the table in the long term. We can't solve the Tibetan plateau for the next 50 years because it's still going to be a mess. But we have to look into the longer future of what we are all about in dealing with this.
Wonderful. That precisely brings me to the last question, which is, I think you've already given a very important hint into it. Do you think the Hindu-Buddhist legacy of peaceful coexistence with all species on planet Earth, do you think this is a panacea to not just the Tibetan problem, but the entire problem of climate change? That's the last question for today.
Who would you like to start?
Yeah,
Ladies first? How about ladies first, sir? Gender
Thank
equity.
you. Thank you, Ishiji. Yes, in Buddhism, we believe that living in coexistence, and it is not only the world, the planet is not only for the human being. It is for like whole certain beings who are living on this planet, right? So whatever we do, like it's in this IBCC report and all this climate change report, we can see that like all this climate change, global warming are made by the human being, right? It is a human induced climate change. And therefore, like we, as a as a Buddhist, like I truly believe that we should be the one who are creating all this destruction. We are the one who are creating this destruction, and we should be the one who should solve this problem. We have the capability, and as His Holiness always says that we should. This is the only planet which we have, and we should protect it. And the Tibet is its roof, and therefore, like yeah, we everyone has responsibility to protect the whole of the world environment. Thank you.
Hmm. Yeah, Dr. Mills.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would almost sort of encourage Tibetans to be far more ambitious in this intellectual sense. They certainly have, well, and this is an interesting area and an important one. I'm sorry, I'm going to go slightly sideways on my area of being an anthropologist. We have divided the world up in intellectual terms into kind of European and American intellectual thought, and then there's kind of Asian intellectual thought, and we kind of keep a little bit of a wall between them, which is a terrible shame because many of the debates we see in Western society today were occurring 2,000 years ago in India. Other questions, for example, of identity and who people are and things on those lines. And these are areas where there is a great deal of intellectual experience. Now, earlier I was sort of quite nasty about European and American tendencies to be exclusively materialist. And I use the word exclusively because I don't think there's anything wrong with being a materialist as long as you can be other things too. And that kind of balance between not the sort of spiritual in the sense of something else completely out there in the world, but ideas that give us some kind of form for living productively and meaningfully in a world without at the same time just endlessly consuming things is something we have to look toward. We can't just say to people, you have to stop all the things that we said were good. That's our problem that we face now. We're effectively turning around and saying, oh, I'm sorry, we told you all of this was what you should aspire to. No, sorry, you got to kind of pull back. You actually have to give people a goal, a positive goal, and that goal, I think, is one that, let's take Tibetan culture, Tibetan Buddhist culture in particular. What is it better to be? We often talk in the West about being normal, about being a customer, about all of these things. Which is it better to be, for example, a customer or a precious human rebirth? There are concepts of aspiration and meaning that are found particularly within the Indian and Tibetan traditions. But also, I hasten to add the Chinese traditions, if I may point towards Lao Tzu or Chuang Tzu or writers such as those, all of those which point toward forms of aspiration and deeply meaningful existence that doesn't require you to destroy the world around you. And the truth of the matter is they're held at bay, and we pretend that they're sort of not respectable or a bit silly. In the West, we do that. We kind of hold them out of court. We say they're not really pragmatic. But the truth of the matter is our pragmatism has proved pretty impractical. It didn't take long either. It took a couple of 100 years.
Right. So I think we are coming to conclusion. And in the last part of this discussion, I found that one question which our friend Anjali Mishra had put, that we have been talking only of glaciers and water crises, but we should also be caring about issues related to vegetation, flora, fauna. A good part of this question, her question was brilliant. And I am sure in the last part of our discussion, these issues have been handled quite, rather than debate from the wisdom side. So I think this is time when we have to come to conclusion of this this webinar. And now may I request our friend Sonam Tsering to please give a vote of thanks. And I'm sure after that we meet very soon with another issue. Sonam Tseringla.
Am I audible?
Yes, very much. Like Tibetan Youth Congress.
With this, we came to the end of this webinar. So this webinar wouldn't be possible without the support and participation of our expert panelists and our members. So first of all, I would like to extend our sincere thanks to Dr. Martin A. Mills for accepting our invitation and sharing your insight and enlightening us on the topic. And also, we thank you for coordinating the Scottish Parliamentary Third Pole Climate Inquiry since from 2019. So, thank you, Dr. A. Mills. And secondly, I want to thank Destin Pamula from TPE. Right after her successful participation in COP26, we called her and she accepted her participation in our webinar right away. So thank you for your kind acceptance and sharing your insights on the topic from the Tibetan perspective. And we are looking forward to calling you Dr. Dechinla very soon. Thank you, Dechinla. And thirdly, I, on behalf of the Tibetan Youth Congress and Chase, extend our sincere thanks to Vijay ji, currently the director of Chase and co-host of this webinar, for your support and also for always reminding us with new topics on the coming webinars. Vijay ji is a strong supporter of Tibetan independence and a good friend of Tibetan Youth Congress for many years. So thank you, Vijay ji. And fourth, I want to extend our sincere thanks to Professor Ayush Kerkaji for handling the question and answer as always. And also, I want to thank our young journalist Anjali Mishra for taking care of the media side of our webinars. And lastly, would like to extend our sincere thanks to Tenzin Thaila from the Tibetan Action Institute for providing us support in the technical side. And he always spares 3 or 4 hours of his weekend for our webinars, and he always makes posters for our webinars and other seminars as well. So thank you, Taylor. And lastly, I, on behalf of the Tibetan Youth Congress and Chess, extend our sincere thanks to all the audience who are participating us through the live. And we couldn't do a Facebook live stream this time due to some technical issues. So we uh, pay our apologies for this, and thank you for the participation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So we come to conclusion of this wonderful discussion, and thank you very much, everybody. And I'm sure very soon we are going to meet with another subject. And now we say goodbye from Chase and TYC, and wish you all best, and especially our prayers for people around Dr. Mill's hometown, where we had some a catastrophic uh, happening last evening. So our prayers are with you and people in UK, and especially those areas which suffered this catastrophe. And let us now say goodbye to meet once again very soon with a very more interesting subject on related to the Himalayan Asia region, especially China, Tibet, um, East Turkestan, South Mongolia, etc. So thank you. Namaskar. Good night.
Thank you, Tujit.
Good night.
Thank you.